In the year 1872, the South was a land of power, wealth, and deep-rooted inequalities. It was a time when the elite plantation owners, basking in the wealth derived from the labor of enslaved people, believed themselves untouchable. These men, wealthy, respected, and feared, held dominion over both the land and the lives of those who worked it. But beneath the surface of this seemingly invincible world, a storm was quietly gathering. A storm in the form of a woman, whose beauty was only the surface of something far more dangerous. She was known by many names, though her true one has been lost to history. In whispers and stories passed down through generations, she became known as the Black Widow. A woman who would strike fear into the hearts of even the most powerful men, a woman whose seduction would not only claim the hearts of men but also their lives. Her story, shrouded in mystery and bloodshed, begins with the first of 11 murders, each one more shocking than the last. These were no random acts of violence, no spur-of-the-moment crimes. No, they were calculated, methodical, and chillingly precise. 11 powerful plantation masters who thought themselves invulnerable to any threat would be left in their beds, their throats slit by a woman they had never seen coming. A woman who moved like a ghost, her actions hidden in plain sight, until the moment when death would come. But this wasn't just about murder. This was a battle for power. A battle for revenge. And in a world where the oppressed had no voice, she would make sure hers was heard loud and clear. Her plan unfolded like a twisted masterpiece, a series of seductions, manipulations, and calculated strikes that left behind a wake of bloodshed. She wasn't just a woman driven by vengeance. She was a symbol of something deeper, something that terrified the very men who believed they could control everything. As each of her victims fell, the mystery deepened. Who was this woman? What drove her to kill? What did she know that the others didn't? And how did she slip through the cracks of a world designed to keep her invisible? These questions, and more, would remain unanswered until the end. Her story, though largely forgotten by time, is one that echoes through the annals of history. It's a story of a woman who, in the face of unthinkable odds, became a force of reckoning. The Black Widow was more than just a murderer, she was a symbol of justice in a world that had none, and her actions would forever alter the power dynamics of a society built on oppression. Before we dive into this dark tale of seduction, betrayal, and bloodshed, make sure to subscribe for more videos that explore the most chilling and mysterious stories from history. You won't want to miss what's coming next. She was born into a world where her name would never be spoken in halls of power, her story would never be told in the salons of the elite, and her presence would be relegated to the shadows of the very life she was forced to live. Yet, it was in those shadows where her legend began to take shape. She was born into slavery, a child of the fields, whose mother and father were bound by the same chains that would tie her life to a fate far darker than she could have ever imagined. The world she was born into was one of stark contrast. On one side, the sprawling plantations with their grand houses, lush gardens, and powerful masters who ruled over hundreds of lives with little more than a flick of their wrist. On the other, the fields, endless rows of cotton and tobacco, where men, women, and children worked from dawn until dusk, their sweat and blood the true currency of wealth for the plantation owners. This was the world of the antebellum South, a world where power was forged from the cruelty of slavery, and where people like her were seen as nothing more than property. Her body, like the others, was owned by someone else. She was part of a system that allowed men to claim everything, from the land beneath their feet to the souls of those who worked it. Yet, as much as she was a part of that system, she was also a silent observer, watching the lives of the plantation masters with the keen eyes of someone who understood that the powerful always have their weaknesses. They were arrogant, these masters. They believed their wealth was their shield, that their status would protect them from the consequences of their actions. They thought themselves untouchable, above reproach, but they never saw her coming. She spent her early years on the plantation like all the others, laboring under the scorching sun, performing the tasks assigned to her without question. But while the others toiled in the fields, she studied. She watched the plantation owners and their families. How they carried themselves, how they spoke, how they wielded their power. She learned the ways of the masters, the subtle shifts in their behavior, their desires, their vices. They were human after all, and like all humans, they had their flaws. She saw those flaws, and she began to understand the game they played, the game that had trapped her, and everyone like her, in a web of oppression and cruelty. As she grew older, something within her began to change. It wasn't just the physical beauty she had inherited, it was her mind, sharp and calculating, that began to take shape. She knew her value in this world, she knew her beauty could be a weapon. But it wasn't just the men in the house who were her targets, it was the very system they had created. With beauty as her weapon, and vengeance as her fuel, she began to devise a plan. A plan that would turn the tables, a plan that would destroy those who had made her and her people nothing more than pawns in their twisted game. She was married, briefly, to a man who shared her fate. Like so many others, her husband was born into slavery. He, too, worked the land, bound by chains invisible to the eye but heavy on the soul. Their life was simple, yet there was love between them, something rare in a world where love was often something that the system sought to destroy. But her husband, like so many others, was owned by the master of the plantation, and when that master decided to sell him away, she lost the one person she truly loved. It was in that loss that something in her changed, something shifted deep within her heart. Her husband was sold, ripped away from her, and in that moment, she was left alone. Alone, but no longer powerless. She had always been a quiet presence in the background, a woman who observed, who calculated, who bided her time. Now, the quiet observer became the quiet avenger. Her rage burned, and her love for her husband turned to hate for the men who had torn him from her. The plantation masters, those very men who had owned her and her family, had turned her into a widow, a black widow. And it was that very title, that very loss, that would fuel her pursuit of vengeance. It was no longer just about survival. It was about something more. It was about rewriting the rules, about taking back what had been stolen from her and countless others like her. She would become the thing they feared most, a woman who could break them, who could bring down the empire they had built on the backs of the oppressed. But the path she chose was not one of mercy. The Black Widow did not seek forgiveness or justice in the way others might have. No, she sought retribution. Her plan was not to simply take back what had been taken from her. It was to strike at the heart of the very system that had created her suffering, and the suffering of so many others. With each plantation master, she saw not just a man, but a symbol of everything that had kept her and her people in chains. And with every man, she would strike. First, she would seduce him, drawing him in with her beauty, her charm, her calculated smile. Then, when he believed he had control, she would strike, quick, silent, and deadly. A widow no longer, she became a predator, hunting those who had caused her grief, one after another. As her legend began to spread, whispers of the Black Widow's vengeance swept through the South. The men she killed never knew what hit them. They were too proud, too wrapped up in their own belief of superiority, to see the threat standing right in front of them. They didn't know that the very woman they had brought into their beds, the very woman they thought they had tamed, would be the one to end their lives. Her rise to infamy was swift, but it was not without its challenges. As her body count grew, so did the questions. Who was she? How was she able to move so freely, so unnoticed, in a world that watched the enslaved at every turn? How could a woman, someone they saw as nothing more than property, become the most dangerous person in the South? The plantation masters, with their wealth and their power, were baffled. She was always one step ahead, always careful, always calculating. But behind her cold exterior was a mind driven by something deeper than revenge. It was a thirst for justice, for balance, for the reckoning that the South was so desperately avoiding. She wasn't just killing men, she was dismantling the very foundation of the society that had held her captive. And she would stop at nothing to bring it all down. And so, with each death, her legend grew. Each victim became another story, another whispered tale in the dark corners of the South, until the very name of the Black Widow struck fear into the hearts of those who once thought themselves untouchable. She was no longer just a woman, no longer just a widow. She had become something more, a force of nature, an avenging spirit, a symbol of something deeper, something the powerful had never considered, the fury of the oppressed. Her first kill wasn't one of rage or desperation. It wasn't an act of impulse driven by emotion, but rather a calculated and deliberate move, the opening move in a much larger game. She had spent years observing, learning, and waiting. And now, the time had come. The man she chose for her first victim was no mere plantation master. He was a man who embodied the cruelty of the system, a man whose reputation had spread like wildfire among his peers, known for his harsh treatment of the people on his land. His name was Charles Winthrop, a man whose wealth had been built on the backs of those who had no voice, a man who saw his slaves as nothing more than tools to be used, worked until they broke, and replaced when they could no longer serve him. She had watched him for months before making her move. She knew his routine, his weaknesses, his vices. Winthrop was a man who reveled in his power, whose arrogance blinded him to the reality that others might pose a threat. He saw her as nothing more than a servant, a piece of property, like all the others. But she wasn't like the others. She had learned to play the game, to manipulate the men who thought they held control. To him, she was just another woman who could be easily manipulated, controlled by his charm and wealth. And that, she realized, was where she would strike. She began to seduce him, slowly and methodically. A glance here, a soft word there, building his trust, weaving a web that would make him believe that she was just like the others, submissive, compliant, eager to please. But in reality, she was playing him, playing every word and every gesture like a seasoned performer. She learned his desires, his insecurities, and she used them against him. Winthrop, for all his wealth and power, was still a man with flaws, flaws she was more than capable of exploiting. She was no stranger to the art of seduction, and she used it to gain access to his world, to enter his home, to become the one thing he thought he could trust. For weeks, she carefully planted the seeds of intimacy between them, drawing him in closer with each passing day. He spoke to her of his wealth, of his plans, of the people he had crushed underfoot to get where he was. And she listened, all the while watching him, assessing the best moment to strike. He never suspected a thing. He was too arrogant, too self-assured, to think that a woman like her could be anything more than a pawn in his game. And when she was finally invited into his bed, when he was convinced of her loyalty, she knew the moment had arrived. The night of the murder, the air was heavy with the scent of impending doom. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold light across the room where Winthrop lay sleeping. He had spent the evening boasting of his exploits, enjoying the spoils of his ill-gotten wealth, and now he lay in a drunken stupor, lulled into a false sense of security. He was a man who thought nothing could touch him, a man who thought his wealth and status had made him invincible. But as he slept, unaware of the fate that awaited him, she moved with the quiet grace of a predator. She stood over him, her eyes cold, calculating, every inch of her being focused on the task at hand. She had studied him, learned his every habit, and now she would finish what she had started. The blade in her hand gleamed in the pale moonlight, a silent promise of the death she was about to deliver. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. This was justice, a reckoning long overdue, and she would be the one to deliver it. With a swift, practiced motion, she slashed the blade across his throat. The blood spilled out quickly, staining the sheets, pooling around his body. He didn't wake up. He didn't scream. There was only the soft sound of his body shifting as life left it, the last breath escaping his lungs as the blood poured from him. In the stillness of the night, under the heavy weight of the moonlight, the Black Widow struck. The blood of a man who had brutalized others now spilled from his own throat, marking the beginning of a series of deaths that would rattle the South to its core. The room fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of something irreversible, the silence that follows when a powerful man has been brought low, when the inevitable has finally come to pass. She stood there for a moment, watching, listening, feeling the weight of the act she had just committed. But it wasn't regret that filled her heart, it was resolve. She had taken the first step on a path that would lead her to the very heart of the system that had oppressed her, that had crushed her people underfoot. She had claimed her first victim, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. In the days that followed, the death of Charles Winthrop would be whispered about in hushed tones. The other plantation masters would mourn his loss, some with genuine sorrow, others with the cold indifference of men who had long learned to disregard human life. But none of them would realize the truth, not yet. They would never understand that the Black Widow had just begun her work, and that the bloodshed would continue until they were all dead. The first death was only the beginning. The Black Widow knew her actions would send shockwaves through the region. News of Winthrop's death would spread quickly, reaching the ears of every plantation owner, every overseer, every person who had ever held power over the enslaved. But it wasn't just fear that would rise from this first killing, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. She knew that with each death, with each strike, her power would grow. She wasn't just taking lives, she was taking control. And as her legend grew, so would her influence, spreading like wildfire across the land. And so, the Black Widow's story began, not with a flash of rage, but with a quiet, methodical strike against the man who had thought himself untouchable. And as the bodies began to pile up, as the blood began to spill, the plantation masters would come to learn the one thing they had never expected, that the greatest danger to their power was a woman they had never seen coming. With Charles Winthrop's death, the Black Widow's legend was born, and with it, a series of carefully orchestrated murders that would spread like wildfire. Each victim was a carefully selected mark, a man who represented the wealth, power, and cruelty that had shaped her life. As she moved through the shadows of the South, she knew exactly who to target and how to strike. She seduced them one by one, drawing them in with the same skill, the same allure that had fooled Winthrop. But for each man, she also had a purpose, a reason that went beyond personal vengeance. They were symbols of everything that had oppressed her and her people. Each man she killed was another step in dismantling the system that had held her captive for so long. The first murder was just the beginning, and it wouldn't be long before the Black Widow claimed her second victim. Victim number 2 was a man named Richard Graves. A cruel overseer, Graves ran one of the largest plantations in the region with an iron fist. His reputation was notorious, his brutality toward the enslaved was well known, and he had earned his place at the top by ruling through fear and violence. Unlike Winthrop, Graves was not a man who sought pleasure from the comforts of the rich life, his power was derived from the way he controlled those beneath him. He was the kind of man who used violence as currency, whipping and torturing slaves without hesitation. He saw them as nothing more than tools, objects to be broken and used at his whim. The Black Widow knew exactly how to exploit his pride. She saw in him a man whose cruelty was a mask for deep insecurities, a man who hid his vulnerability behind his anger and violence. She played on his ego, pretending to be just another woman who was frightened by his temper and power, drawing him in with soft words and hesitant gestures. She made him believe he had complete control over her, that he could bend her to his will, just as he had done with every other woman and slave before her. But as with Winthrop, it was all part of the plan. She seduced him slowly, carefully, using her beauty as a tool to weave him deeper into her web. The night of his death, Graves, like so many others, was intoxicated by his own sense of superiority. She had him exactly where she wanted him. He was at ease, believing in his own invincibility, confident that no one could touch him. As he slept, sprawled on the bed after an evening of wine and self-congratulation, she crept into the room. In a flash, she silenced his muffled breathing with a quick, clean stroke of the blade across his throat. The blood poured out, staining the sheets as he gasped in his final moments, never once realizing what was happening. As the life drained from his body, she was gone, slipping into the shadows before anyone could even begin to realize the overseer was dead. The third victim came soon after, Harrison Claiborne, a businessman who trafficked in human lives. Claiborne wasn't a plantation master, he was something far worse. A man who saw people as property to be bought, sold, and traded. He dealt in slaves, moving them across state lines like cattle, profiting off the misery of others. He was wealthy, ruthless, and had connections with some of the most powerful men in the South. He thought his wealth and influence would protect him. But like the others, he underestimated the Black Widow. She had observed him for months, watching the way he moved through the world, the way he used charm to mask his cruelty. Claiborne saw her as an opportunity, just another woman to seduce and control, another pawn in his world of exploitation. He invited her into his life, believing she would be another easy conquest. He never imagined that the woman he sought to dominate would be the one who would bring his empire crashing down. As she had done with the others, she carefully played her part, allowing him to believe she was just another willing participant in his twisted game. She fed his vanity, made him believe she was entranced by his power and wealth. But all the while, she was watching him, learning his weaknesses. When the time came, she was ready. On the night of his death, she met him at his estate, where they dined and drank together. Claiborne, wrapped in his own arrogance, never saw the danger. She was quiet, composed, even flirtatious as they moved to his private chambers. There, in the dimly lit room, she did what she had done before, she struck. But unlike the others, this time, she made it a personal affair. She tied him to his own bed, forcing him to experience the helplessness he had imposed on so many others. And then, with a single motion, she took his life, leaving his body behind as another symbol of her revenge. The pattern was beginning to form, and with it, a sense of growing fear. The plantation masters, the businessmen, and the overseers who had once been the rulers of the South began to realize that someone, was picking them off one by one. They couldn't understand it. How could this be happening? Who was behind it? Why were they being targeted? Each death brought a new level of fear and suspicion. The Black Widow's methods were flawless. She knew exactly when to strike and when to slip away unnoticed, disappearing into the shadows before anyone could find any trace of her. Each victim, whether it was the cruel overseer, the businessman who profited from human suffering, or the corrupt master, had no idea what was coming. They had all underestimated her. They all believed they were invincible. But as the body count rose, so did the sense of impending doom. The Black Widow was no longer just a name whispered in the corners of the South. She was a force, a specter who moved unseen through the shadows, picking off the men who thought they were untouchable. The fear was palpable. They were no longer in control. And the more they tried to tighten their grip on power, the more she slipped away, leaving only death and confusion in her wake. As the stakes grew higher, so did her confidence. She was no longer just avenging the wrongs done to her. She was dismantling a system, one life at a time. Each kill was part of something bigger. She wasn't just taking lives, she was taking control, and she wasn't going to stop until the very foundations of the South had been brought to their knees. As the body count mounted, the fear that had once lingered in the background began to take root in the hearts of the Southern elite. What had started as a strange series of isolated deaths soon became something far more sinister. The plantation owners, once untouchable and secure in their wealth and power, found themselves looking over their shoulders, unsure of who might be the next victim. The sense of invulnerability that had defined their lives began to crumble, replaced by an overwhelming sense of paranoia. The wealthy men and women of the South, who had once ruled over everything with impunity, now found themselves powerless in the face of a force they couldn't see, touch, or understand. The first whispers of the investigation came when the body of a fourth victim was discovered. A plantation master, known for his indulgence in debauchery, was found dead in his bed, a single, clean cut across his throat. The scene was eerily familiar to the others, and soon, a pattern began to emerge. The victims were all powerful men, wealthy, corrupt, cruel, and the circumstances of their deaths mirrored one another with chilling precision. But despite this pattern, the authorities were stumped. No one could understand how such a woman, so bold and elusive, could have carried out these murders without leaving a trace. Enter Detective William Blake, a seasoned investigator from the nearby town, called in to look into the string of killings. Blake was known for his sharp mind and cold demeanor, but even he found this case to be unlike anything he had ever encountered. With every new death, he became more determined to uncover the truth. He had seen the remnants of the lives the victims had lived, wealthy men who had never faced a consequence in their lives, men who had thought themselves safe behind the walls of their grand estates. But now they were dead, and Blake could sense something far more disturbing at work. "Whoever's doing this is no amateur," he said to his partner, a younger officer named Samuel Harris, as they stood over the body of the latest victim. "These deaths aren't just random, they're calculated. It's as if someone's making a statement." The investigation soon hit a dead end. There were no witnesses, no forensics that could point to a suspect, and no signs of forced entry. The victims, all powerful men in their own right, had been killed in their own beds while they slept, as though their deaths had been preordained by someone with an intimate knowledge of their habits. Despite the growing list of bodies, the authorities were no closer to finding the killer. As the investigation dragged on, the plantation owners began to grow increasingly paranoid. Rumors spread like wildfire through the community. Some believed the killer was a group of rebels, a vengeance-driven mob seeking to punish the elite for their decades of cruelty. Others whispered that it was the work of an escaped slave, or even a group of slaves united in secret rebellion. But every theory fell short. The murders seemed to have no rhyme or reason, no connection that could be easily understood. In private gatherings, once cohesive circles of plantation owners began to fracture. Friends became enemies, and the threat of death seemed to loom over every conversation. Everyone was suspect, everyone was a potential target, and the Black Widow's presence, though unseen, was felt by all. Detective Blake grew frustrated. With every death, he dug deeper into the lives of the victims, looking for a link that could explain the string of murders. He interviewed neighbors, workers, even the families of the deceased, but all his leads turned cold. It was as though the killer was always one step ahead, moving too quickly and carefully to ever be caught. The pattern itself became a mystery. Why these men? Why had they been chosen? What could they all possibly have in common? Blake's eyes narrowed as he began to suspect that the killer wasn't just targeting them for their wealth or their cruelty. There was something else at play, something deeper. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the puzzle in front of him, but every lead seemed to slip through his fingers. And all the while, the Black Widow continued her deadly work, slipping through the cracks of the system the authorities had built to protect the powerful. She was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, an enigma. She seemed to have no motive but vengeance, yet her victims were more than just the cruel or the corrupt. They were men who represented everything that had kept her and so many others enslaved and oppressed. And yet, Blake didn't yet understand the true nature of the killer he was chasing. As the murders continued, so too did the fear and suspicion among the community. Blake started to piece together a few of the smaller details. Glimpses into the lives of the victims, their families, and even the workers on the plantations. It wasn't much, but it was something. He began to sense that these murders weren't just random acts of revenge. They were something more. Something systematic. Someone was playing a game, and Blake had yet to figure out the rules. With every death, the mystery deepened, the narrator's voice would echo, filling the space of every tense moment. A woman of such skill, such cunning, was not someone they could easily catch. And still, she moved like a shadow in the night, always one step ahead. The authorities were no closer to understanding her than they had been when the first death occurred. Blake felt a gnawing frustration, realizing that each victim was a piece of a larger puzzle, but without the key, he was unable to unlock the truth. The more he searched for answers, the more elusive they became. The tension mounted as another body was discovered, the body of a man who had been a close friend of the previous victims. No one could ignore the increasing frequency of the deaths, and the panic among the plantation owners grew. It wasn't just the fear of death that haunted them now, it was the realization that they had no control over what was happening. They were at the mercy of a faceless killer who had proven time and time again that she could strike without warning and disappear just as quickly. Blake's frustration turned to obsession. He could not let this case slip away. He felt as though he was on the edge of something important, that if he could just connect the dots, the whole story would unravel before him. But each time he got close, the killer slipped further from his grasp. The Black Widow was not just a killer. She was a force. A shadow that moved in the dark corners of society, unseen but ever present. And as the investigation continued, one thing became clear: the deeper Blake dug, the closer he came to the realization that the killer he was chasing wasn't just a murderer. She was rewriting the rules of power. And until he understood her, he could never catch her. The investigation had gone on for months, but despite the tireless efforts of Detective Blake and his team, they were no closer to unraveling the mystery of the Black Widow. Each clue seemed to lead to a dead end, and the body count continued to rise. The fear had gripped the South like an iron vice, and the whispers of the killer's legend had only grown louder. No one was safe. The once proud plantation owners, men who had considered themselves untouchable, were now cowering in their homes, fearful that the next knock on the door would be their last. But it was a chance encounter, a small detail, that would finally reveal the truth. It happened on a hot summer evening, as Blake was reviewing the case files one final time. He was weary, the weight of the case pressing down on him, when one of his officers, a young man named Samuel Harris, came rushing into the room. "Detective, you need to see this," Harris said, his voice urgent. Blake followed him into the next room, where a witness sat, trembling with fear. It was a former servant of one of the victims, a woman who had worked in the mansion of the late Richard Graves, the cruel overseer. Her name was Charlotte, and she had been the one to find Graves' lifeless body that night. She had seen something that, until now, had remained hidden. I didn't want to say anything," Charlotte began, her voice shaking. "But now, with all these men dead, I can't keep quiet anymore. I know who did it. I saw her. I saw the woman who killed him. She came into the house the night Graves died. She was there, in the shadows, and I saw her leave after it happened." Blake leaned in, his heart pounding. "What woman? What do you mean? Who was she?" Charlotte hesitated, then finally spoke, her eyes wide with fear. "It was the woman who worked in the fields. The one who, everyone thought was just a servant. But she wasn't just that. She wasn't just anyone. She was the one. She was the Black Widow." The words hit Blake like a thunderclap. The pieces, which had eluded him for so long, were now falling into place. He stared at Charlotte, trying to process what she had just said. "The Black Widow. Are you sure?" Charlotte nodded, her face pale. "I saw her. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something about her, something cold, something dangerous. She was never like the others. She never fit in. But I thought she was just a slave, like everyone else. I didn't know until now. I didn't know she was the one who had killed him, or any of them." It was then that the horrifying truth began to dawn on Blake. All this time, he had been searching for a single man, a group, or a faceless killer. But what he had failed to see was that the killer was a woman, someone who had infiltrated the very world she had been forced to serve. She had moved among them, never once drawing suspicion, never once raising a question, because they all underestimated her. Blake's mind raced as he processed the details. The murders were not random. They were deliberate, methodical, and carried out by someone who had studied her targets, understood their weaknesses, and used their vices to get close to them. And all this time, the Black Widow had been hiding in plain sight. She had been part of their world, a servant, a woman who had been overlooked by everyone, until she became the master of the game. Her strategy had been brilliant. She had used their own arrogance, their lust, and their greed against them. She had seduced them, played on their vanity, and then, one by one, she had destroyed them. It wasn't just a matter of revenge for her, it was something far more calculated. She had been scorned by society, rejected by the very people she had once served, and now, she was turning the tables. Blake stood up, his face hardening with the realization that they had underestimated her. We have to find her. Now. Before she kills again. The search for the Black Widow took on a new urgency. Blake knew that with each passing day, the woman he was chasing was getting closer to her ultimate goal. And now, it wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about stopping a woman who had turned her pain into power, and who had become a weapon in her own right. The detectives began to gather their resources, looking for any trace of her that might lead them to her final hiding place. But it wasn't until a few weeks later, after another murder, that they would finally get the chance to confront her. Blake and his team arrived at the plantation late one evening, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass as they made their way to the house where the latest body had been found. The air was heavy with the scent of earth, and the faint sound of crickets filled the night. They knew she would be there, waiting, ready to strike again. But this time, they were prepared. They entered the house cautiously, moving through the darkened halls. And then, as they rounded a corner, they saw her. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, her back to them, her face half hidden in the shadows. She turned slowly, her eyes locking with Blake's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was no fear in her eyes, only cold, unflinching resolve. "You're too late," she said, her voice soft but deadly. Blake's heart raced, but he didn't move. He knew this was the moment, the confrontation that had been building up for so long. She was no longer just a shadow, a name in the whispers of the South. She was a woman who had outsmarted them all, a woman who had become the very thing they had never expected, a weapon. Her smile, though small, was knowing, almost triumphant. She had played the game better than anyone had imagined, and now, it was over. Blake stepped forward, but she didn't flinch. She had already won. The capture of the Black Widow, the woman who had terrorized the powerful elite of the South, came swiftly after her final confrontation with Detective Blake and his team. Despite the careful planning that had allowed her to evade capture for so long, it was the relentless pursuit of justice that ultimately cornered her. It wasn't a dramatic chase or a desperate struggle. Instead, she was apprehended quietly, almost as if she had known this moment would come. Perhaps she had grown tired, or perhaps she simply knew that her time had run out. Either way, her capture marked the end of the trail of bloodshed that had followed her for so long. The details of her trial remain lost to history. Some say she was put on trial for her murders, while others suggest that she was executed quietly, her legacy too dangerous to be allowed to live on. There is no definitive answer, no clear conclusion to her life. In the years following her capture, the records of her trial and final moments were obscured, erased by those who wanted to forget her. The power she had wielded, her ability to bring the mighty to their knees, was something the authorities couldn't afford to acknowledge. The story of the Black Widow, though briefly interrupted, was never fully silenced. For the public, the reaction to her capture was mixed. To some, she was a hero. A symbol of justice for the oppressed, a woman who had struck back at a system that had long treated people like her as nothing more than property. They saw in her a figure of empowerment, someone who had taken matters into her own hands when the law failed to protect her or her people. To them, she was more than just a murderer, she was a symbol of resistance, a woman who had taken on the mighty and crushed them, one by one. But for the wealthy plantation owners and their allies, she was a villain, a dangerous criminal who had disrupted the natural order of society. They saw her as a threat to everything they held dear, someone who had shown that no one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the consequences of their actions. The Black Widow's name became synonymous with fear, and those who had once been her victims now sought to erase her from the history books entirely. In the end, the public's reaction was divided. Some saw her as a tragic figure, forced into a life of servitude, rejected by society, and pushed to the brink of madness by the injustices she had endured. Others saw her as a cold, calculating killer, a woman who had gone too far and taken the law into her own hands, regardless of the cost. Her actions were unforgivable to some, and for others, they were a necessary evil. The truth about her legacy is just as complicated. The Black Widow's name may have been buried by those in power, but her story never fully faded away. For years, her tale lived on in whispers, passed down through generations as a dark reminder of the power dynamics that shaped the South. To some, she was a myth, a cautionary tale of what could happen when the oppressed rose up against their oppressors. To others, she was a symbol of revenge and justice, someone who fought back against a system that had crushed her spirit. As time passed, her story was retold, distorted by the people who told it. Some remembered her as a vengeful murderer, others as a folk hero. But no matter how she was remembered, her legacy remained tied to the violence she unleashed and the world she sought to dismantle. The Black Widow became a shadow in the historical narrative, too dangerous to be fully embraced, too powerful to be completely forgotten. And yet, despite the efforts to bury her story, her legend never died. The Black Widow became a symbol of the lengths to which a woman, scorned by history, would go to seek revenge. In a world where men held all the power and women were silenced, she was a reminder that even the most oppressed could rise up and take control of their fate, no matter the cost. Her actions, brutal and calculated as they were, became the stuff of legend, a chilling reminder of what can happen when the scales of justice are tipped too far in one direction. The Black Widow was not just a killer. She was a weapon, one that used the tools of manipulation, seduction, and vengeance to bring down those who thought they were invincible. In the end, the South, torn apart by the horrors of slavery, would never be the same. The plantation system, built on the backs of the oppressed, was crumbling. And in the shadows of its history, the name of the Black Widow lives on, haunting the men and women who would dare to forget the price of their actions. Her story, tragic and dark, is a tale of a woman who was forced into a life of hardship and pain, only to rise from it as something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Black Widow may have been forgotten by those in power, but her legacy remains, a testament to the strength of a woman scorned, a woman who fought back against a world that never saw her coming. And as long as the story is told, as long as it continues to echo through the ages, the Black Widow's legend will never truly die. As the years passed, the name of the Black Widow faded into the mists of time, buried beneath layers of history, obscured by the desire of those in power to forget her legacy. The grand plantations, once teeming with the blood and sweat of the enslaved, became silent monuments to the past, silent, except for the whispers of the people who remembered. But her story, though hidden, never fully disappeared. It lingered in the corners of the South, in hushed voices shared among those who knew the true cost of slavery, of oppression. The Black Widow, though her body may have been lost to history, remains a symbol of the lengths one woman was willing to go to bring justice to a broken world. As the camera fades to black, the narrator's voice breaks the silence. And though the Black Widow vanished into the pages of history, her blood-stained legacy continues to haunt us all. Her name may be forgotten by many, but her actions, the fear she inspired, the justice she delivered, will never fade from the collective memory of those who dare to remember. Now, as you reflect on this dark chapter of history, ask yourself, what would you have done? In the face of unimaginable cruelty, would you have remained silent, or would you have fought back? If you've been moved by the story of the Black Widow, if her legacy has made you think about the power dynamics that still shape our world today, don't let her story end here. Share it with others, so that we can keep her memory alive. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more chilling tales from history, more stories of those who defied the odds and left their mark on the world. Like this video, comment below and let us know where you're watching from, and share it with your friends. The Black Widow's story is one that needs to be heard, and together, we can make sure it's never forgotten. Stay tuned for more, because history is waiting to be uncovered, one dark story at a time.